The morning Birdie Hart walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Callow Creek with nothing but the dust on her boots and the sting of tears she refused to let fall. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, as if the wind itself had paused to watch a woman try not to break in public. It was the spring of 1882, and Callow Creek, Texas, sat baking under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. The town had grown up fast along the edges of a cattle route, the way most towns did out on the frontier, pulled together by ambition and necessity, and the stubborn belief that a person could plant something permanent in ground this hard and this unforgiving. There was a hotel, a livery stable, a doctor's office, a sheriff's department, 2 saloons that stayed busy most nights, and a bank that wore its importance like a tailored suit. There was also Reed's Mercantile, which sat directly across the wide dirt street from the bank, its painted sign slightly faded by 2 years of relentless sun, its porch always swept clean. Birdie had been married to Thomas Hart for 6 years. Thomas had been a decent enough man, a cattle rancher who worked hard and laughed easily, and loved her in the uncomplicated way that some men do, without too much ceremony or poetry, but with a steadiness she had come to rely on the way a house relies on its foundation. When he died of a fever the previous autumn, leaving her with 40 acres of patchy grazing land, a small herd of cattle that was declining faster than she could manage, a mortgage note that was due come spring, and a daughter named June who had just turned 5 years old, Birdie had told herself she would figure it out. She had always figured things out. She was 28 years old and she had not survived a childhood on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, a westward journey, 6 years of frontier marriage, and the brutal loneliness of widowhood to be undone by a bank note. But Harlan Duff, the banker, had been unkind about it. That was what stung more than the refusal itself. He had looked at her across that wide mahogany desk with his small, sharp eyes and his carefully maintained mustache, and he had told her that the bank could not extend the note, could not restructure the terms, could not see a way forward given that the Hart property had no male cosigner, and that the cattle count had dropped below what he deemed a viable threshold. He had used words like liability and insufficient collateral and risk exposure, and he had said all of it in the particular tone of voice that men like Harlan Duff reserved for women who had the audacity to walk into places of financial power and ask for help. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive in a way that was perhaps worse, as though her situation was merely an inconvenience to his afternoon rather than the collapse of her entire world. She had 60 days to settle the note or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the Hart property. 60 days. She had walked out of the bank holding her handbag against her side and keeping her chin level and her eyes forward, which was how she had learned to walk through hard moments, like she was carrying something fragile on top of her head that would shatter if she let her composure slip. The street was busy with mid-morning activity. A wagon rolled past loaded with lumber. 2 cowboys sat on the steps of the hotel sharing a cigarette. A woman Birdie vaguely recognized from church hurried past without looking up. The sun was warm on her face, and the air smelled of horses and earth and somewhere close, fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down. She stood on the bank's front porch for a moment and let herself breathe. Just breathe. June was at home with the neighbor woman, Mrs. Creel, who had agreed to sit with her for the morning. Birdie had told June she was going into town to take care of some paperwork, which was not entirely a lie. She had not told her daughter that the paperwork might result in them losing the only home June had ever known. She needed supplies. Regardless of what was coming, she still needed flour and salt and lamp oil and the small things that kept a household running. She had a little money left, not much, but enough for necessities. She would buy what she needed, go home, and then she would sit down at the kitchen table after June was asleep and she would think. She was good at thinking. She would find a way. She crossed the street toward Reed's Mercantile. The bell above the door announced her arrival, with a cheerful little chime that seemed entirely at odds with her mood. The interior of the Mercantile was cool compared to the street outside, and it smelled wonderfully of coffee beans and leather, and the faint sweetness of dried apples stored in barrels near the back. Shelves ran floor to ceiling along both walls, packed with goods arranged with obvious care. Bolts of fabric, tins of tobacco, jars of hard candy, tools, rope, lamp oil, beeswax candles, medicinal tinctures, sacks of flour and sugar and cornmeal. It was the kind of store that made you feel like the world was still an organized and manageable place, even when you knew it was not. There was a man standing behind the counter. Birdie had seen Silas Reed around town, of course. Callow Creek was not so large that you could avoid knowing people, at least by sight. He had come to town about 2 years ago and bought out old Emmett Pierce's general store after Emmett decided to retire and move closer to his daughter in San Antonio. Silas Reed was somewhere around 32 or 33, lean and broad-shouldered with dark hair that had begun to go silver at the temples and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green, like weathered sage after rain. He had a careful, unhurried way about him, the way of a man who had learned not to waste motion or words. She had exchanged pleasantries with him a handful of times over the months, the ordinary small talk of merchant and customer, nothing more. She knew he was unmarried. She knew he had come from somewhere east of here, though she did not know where exactly. She knew he ran a fair store. He looked up when she came in and gave her a nod of recognition. "Mrs. Hart, good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. He was in the process of writing something in a ledger, and he finished the line he was working on before setting his pen down, which she appreciated. He did not rush to fawn over her or pivot immediately into salesmanship. He simply finished what he was doing and then gave her his attention, which was a small thing but felt respectful in a way she was keenly grateful for this morning. "What can I help you with today?" She pulled the small list from her handbag. "I need flour, salt, lamp oil, 2 pounds of coffee if you have it, and whatever you have in the way of dried beans." She paused. "And if there is thread in a dark blue, I would take a spool of that as well." "I have all of that," he said. "The coffee just came in on yesterday's supply wagon. It is good quality." "That is good to hear." He moved to begin gathering her items, and she followed slowly along the counter, looking at the shelves the way she always did in a store, cataloging what was there, noting what might be useful. She was a practical woman, and she had always found some comfort in practicality. The doing of small things, the acknowledgement of need and supply, the satisfaction of a list completed. He set a 10-pound sack of flour on the counter, then a tin of salt, then a can of lamp oil. He disappeared briefly toward the back and returned with a paper-wrapped block of coffee beans. He began to weigh them on the scale on the counter with the careful efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. Birdie watched his hands. They were capable-looking hands marked by work. There was a scar along the left one that ran from the base of the thumb toward the wrist, old and pale, the kind that came from some incident long past and mostly forgotten. "You were at the bank this morning," he said, not as a question exactly, but not quite a statement either. It was offered gently, as an opening she could walk through or not as she chose. She looked up from his hands to his face. He was not looking at her with curiosity or pity. He was looking at the scale, making a small adjustment to the weight. "I was," she said. "Duff turned you down." "He did." A brief silence. He folded the coffee carefully in its paper wrapping and set it with the other things. "I heard he has been doing that a fair bit lately, to the smaller operations especially. I suppose 40 acres and a dwindling herd does not inspire confidence in a banker," Birdie said, and she was proud of how light she made it sound, how nearly wry. Silas Reed looked at her then directly, and there was something in his expression that was not pity and was not business and was not quite what she had expected from him. It was something more considered than any of those things. "How much is the note?" he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The note on the Hart property." "How much does Duff say you owe?" She stared at him. The question was so direct, so practical and unexpected that she did not quite know how to respond. "Mr. Reed, I do not think that is. I know it is not customary," he said, and his voice was calm and without any edge of presumption. "I am not asking to pry. I have a reason for asking if you will hear it." The store was quiet around them. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of the street, a horse, someone calling to someone else. In here it was still and cool and smelled of coffee and dry goods. She looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman, as she had told herself, and she was standing here with 60 days before the bank took everything her daughter had, so she did not have the luxury of pride overriding sense. $420, she said, due within 60 days. He nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he intended to use constructively. "And the cattle you have left, what is the count and what condition?" 23 head, she said. "They are thin, but they are healthy. I have not had the hands to work them properly since Thomas passed, but they are not sick animals. They just need time and grass and management they are not currently getting." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter. Then he looked up again. "I have a counter offer for you, Mrs. Hart." She crossed her arms slowly, not defensively but thoughtfully, the way a woman does when she is preparing to listen carefully. "I am listening." "I will buy your cattle," he said. "All 23 head at fair market value. Cattle are running about $18 to $20 a head right now for good stock. Even at the low end, 23 head gets you $414, and I will round that up to pay you $430 to cover the note with $10 to spare. That solves your immediate problem with the bank." She stared at him. "And what do you get out of that, Mr. Reed? You run a mercantile, not a cattle operation." "I have been thinking about that for a while," he said, and there was a measured quality to his voice, like a man who had indeed been thinking about something for a while and had arrived at a reasoned conclusion. "I came out here because I intended to do more than run a store. The Mercantile is doing well enough, but I have 40 acres of my own that I bought 6 months ago out past the Hendricks Road, and I had it in mind to start a small herd eventually. Your cattle would get me started, and if you are willing, I would like to discuss a second part of the offer as well." "Which is?" He seemed to consider how to phrase it, and she noticed that he was not a man who rushed past careful consideration just to fill silence. "Your 40 acres border the creek on the north side, if I am remembering the Hart property correctly." "They do," she said slowly, "and my 40 acres sit directly to the east of yours, dry side. My land needs reliable water access. Your land has it." He paused. "I am not suggesting anything inappropriate. I am saying that there is a natural partnership available here if you are interested in one. I buy your cattle, that solves your note. And we discuss some arrangement regarding land and water access that benefits us both, on terms that you find fair and agreeable." Birdie Hart looked at this man she barely knew across a counter stacked with flour and salt and coffee beans, and she felt the peculiar sensation of a door opening in a wall she had believed to be solid. It was not a comfortable feeling, exactly. It was the feeling of possibility, which is sometimes more frightening than its absence because it requires you to hope again. "You are talking about a business arrangement," she said carefully. "I am talking about a practical solution," he agreed. "The shape of it is open to discussion." She exhaled slowly. "I will need to think about it." "Of course you will," he said simply, as though that were the only reasonable response and he had expected nothing less. He began to total her purchases on the ledger. "Take your time, Mrs. Hart. The offer does not expire tomorrow." She paid for her goods, which came to $2.40, and he helped her carry them out to her wagon, and they exchanged nothing more of consequence. But as she drove the wagon back out toward the Hart property along the rut-worn road, with the morning sun climbing and the land spread wide around her in shades of gold and green and dust, she turned the offer over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling all its edges. She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day she went back to Reed's Mercantile. The bell chimed above the door. Silas was helping an older man select a bridle near the tax section, and he looked up at the sound, saw her, and gave a small nod that communicated he would be with her shortly. She waited by the counter, not impatiently. She had used the 3 days well. She had written things down, added figures, considered angles. She had also, if she was being honest with herself, spent some time thinking about him in a way that was not purely financial, and she had then firmly set that thinking aside because she was a practical woman and she had more pressing matters. When the older man left with his bridle, Silas came to the counter and gave her his full attention. "I have thought about it," she said, "and I have some conditions," she said. "I would expect nothing less," he replied, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but had something of warmth in it. She laid out the terms she had worked through. She would sell him 18 of the 23 cattle, keeping 5 for herself, a breeding pair and 3 others, so that she was not starting entirely from nothing on the livestock side. The price per head would be $20 flat, giving her $360, which was not enough alone to cover the note. For the remainder, she was willing to grant him a formal water rights easement across the northern edge of her property in exchange for $65, which with the cattle would bring her to $425, 5 more than she needed. She wanted the water easement to be limited in scope, a defined crossing point, and a defined seasonal calendar, so that her own access to the creek was not compromised. She had written all of this out on a folded piece of paper, which she now laid on the counter between them. He read it carefully. She watched him read it, which told her more about him than he probably realized. He read the way someone reads when they are genuinely processing the content rather than looking for the weakest point to leverage. His expression was thoughtful rather than calculating. When he was done, he looked up. "The water easement terms are fair," he said. "I would want to have it written up properly with a lawyer present, which Callow Creek does not have but the county seat does, and I would suggest we make a trip within the week to file it correctly. The cattle price is fair. I will meet your conditions." She nodded once firmly, the way you seal something. He extended his hand across the counter. She shook it. His grip was steady and warm, and he did not make any more of the gesture than it was. "When can you have the cattle ready to transfer?" he asked. "By the end of the week," she said. "I can have them penned and ready on Saturday morning." "I will be there Saturday morning," he said. She left the store feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, or at least not the simple variety. Something more complicated and more durable. The feeling of a foundation being laid. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear, the kind of early spring day that the Texas hill country occasionally offered up like a gift, warm without being hot, a light wind moving through the grass in long, slow waves. Silas arrived at the Hart property in a wagon with a hired hand named Cal, a young man of maybe 20, with a quiet manner and strong arms, who said very little and worked with efficient competence. They penned the cattle with help from Birdie, who worked alongside them without being asked, in the practical clothes she wore for ranch work, her dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat. She was good with the cattle, Silas noticed. She moved among them without nervousness or hesitation, reading their moods, positioning herself correctly, making the work go smoothly. She had clearly been doing this for years. He found himself watching her more than he needed to, which he noted and filed away. When it was done and the cattle were counted and loaded, he paid her in cash, counting the bills carefully on the top rail of the fence, which she counted again after him with no embarrassment about it. He thought that was exactly right. A woman in her position could not afford to be too polite about money. She offered coffee from the kitchen, and he accepted, not because he needed the coffee, but because it seemed like the natural continuation of the morning. The kitchen of the Hart house was small and well organized, with a window that looked out over the yard and the hills beyond. June was there, sitting at the table with a small cloth doll, examining Silas with the frank and unfiltered scrutiny that children apply to new people. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's direct eyes and a gap between her front teeth where a baby tooth had recently departed. "Who are you?" June asked him. "My name is Silas," he said. I am Mr. Reed from the store in town. June considered this. The candy store. Among other things, he agreed. Mama said we cannot have candy right now because we are watching our pennies, June reported solemnly. Birdie said from where she was pouring coffee at the stove in the tone of a mother who has had this particular conversation before. It is all right, Silas said, and he looked at June with a straight face. Watching your pennies is a very sensible thing to do. I watch mine too. June seemed to accept this philosophical point. She went back to her doll. Birdie set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat across the table with her own. Outside, he could hear Cal moving around in the yard, finishing up. The house smelled of biscuits baked earlier that morning, and the light through the window was warm and domestic and made the small kitchen feel substantial, like a place that had been lived in with purpose. The trip to the county seat, Birdie said, to file the easement. Next Wednesday would suit me if it suits you. I will need to arrange for someone to stay with June, she said. Of course, he said. It is an early start if we want to get there and back in a day. We would leave before sunrise. I can manage that, she said. They drank their coffee and talked a little about the cattle, about the land, about the coming season and what it might mean for the grass conditions. He asked her questions about the property that were practical and relevant, and she answered them accurately, without either false modesty or inflation of the situation. He liked that about her, that precision. He had met many people who could not give you a straight answer about their own circumstances, either because they did not want to or because they had never learned to look clearly at things. Birdie Hart looked clearly at things. He left when Cal brought the wagon around, shaking her hand again at the door. June waved from behind her mother's leg. On the drive back toward town, Cal said, without any particular inflection, "She seems like a capable woman." "She is," Silas said. Cal said nothing else, but Silas sat with the thought for the rest of the drive home, which was longer than the words themselves. The trip to the county seat of Hargrove Falls was, by the standards of frontier travel, uneventful. They left Callow Creek while the stars were still out, Birdie in the wagon seat and Silas handling the reins, moving through the darkness with the steady rhythm of horses that knew their business. The country opened up around them as dawn came on, the sky going from black to purple to the startling pink and gold of a high plain sunrise, the land revealing itself in stages, hills and arroyos, and the occasional stand of live oak rising out of the early morning haze. They talked, not about business or not only about business. It was the kind of conversation that happens on long drives, shaped by the easy flow of hours and the way being in motion together creates a particular intimacy. She asked him where he had come from, and he told her about growing up in Ohio, about his father's dry goods store there, about coming west at 24 because he had read too many accounts of the frontier and needed to find out for himself whether they were true. Were they? She asked. He considered this seriously, which she noticed. He did not dismiss the question. Some of them, he said. The part about the space being real is true. And the part about how hard it is. Both those things are accurate. The part about it being romantic and easy and the domain of free men without consequence or complication, that part was considerably exaggerated. She laughed, a real laugh, not the polished social kind. He found he was very glad he had said the thing that produced that sound. She told him about Missouri, about her family's farm there, about coming west at 22 with Thomas when they first married. She talked about Thomas with the careful honesty of someone who loved a person and grieved them without making that grief into a monument that blocked out everything else. Thomas had been a good man and a good husband, and she missed him, and the loss had been hard, and now she was doing what needed to be done. She said all of this with a kind of clean clarity that he found deeply admirable. He told her about the scar on his hand, which she had clearly noticed that first day in the store. A horse, when he was 19, had gotten spooked and he had caught a nail in the wrong moment. She grimaced sympathetically. He told it without drama, just a piece of information delivered honestly. By the time they reached Hargrove Falls, it was mid-morning and the town was in full swing. They found the county recorder's office and spent an hour with the clerk there, who was a precise little man named Mr. Adkins, who smelled of pipe tobacco and ink, and who drew up the water easement document with the careful attention of someone who genuinely loved official paperwork. It was notarized and filed, and copies were made, one for each of them and one for the county record. Standing outside the recorder's office with the copy in her hands, Birdie felt the last of the immediate crisis lift from her shoulders like a physical weight set down. She had paid off the banknote that morning before they left Callow Creek, arriving at Harlan Duff's desk first thing and setting the money in front of him with a steadiness she had privately rehearsed the night before. Duff had taken the money without anything approaching an apology and had given her the receipt with the brisk efficiency of a man who considered the matter settled on his end. She had smiled at him with exactly as much warmth as was absolutely required, and she had walked out of that building feeling taller than she had gone in. Now, standing in the sunshine of Hargrove Falls with the easement document secured, she turned to Silas and said, "Thank you. I want to say that directly. What you did was generous and practical, and I do not take it lightly." He looked at her in that considered way he had, the way that made her feel genuinely seen rather than assessed. "I benefited from it too," he said. "That is the best kind of arrangement." "Still," she said, "thank you." They had lunch at a small establishment near the main street, a boarding house that served food at noon to travelers, venison stew and cornbread and coffee, and they sat across from each other and talked with the ease of people who had discovered, somewhere on the road between Callow Creek and here, that they were comfortable in each other's company. He noticed how she cut her cornbread into 4 precise pieces before eating it. She noticed how he always looked at the door when someone came in, not anxiously but with the steady awareness of a man accustomed to knowing his surroundings. Small things, the kind that accumulate meaning over time without you quite realizing it. On the drive home, the sun declining westward ahead of them, the conversation wandered into quieter territory. She mentioned that the hardest part of the past months had not been the money, though the money had been terrifying, but the silence. The absence of another adult voice in the house at the end of the day, another person to tell things to. She said it simply, without self-pity, as an observation about the reality of grief, and she looked straight ahead when she said it at the road and the hills. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know something about that silence. Living alone has a particular quality that is different from solitude. Solitude can be peaceful, but the silence that comes from the absence of a specific person is its own thing entirely." She turned her head and looked at him then, and he was also looking straight ahead at the road and the hills, but there was something in his jaw and his shoulders that told her this was not abstract knowledge. "Did you lose someone?" she asked. "Not to death," he said. "A broken engagement some years ago. She decided the West was not what she had bargained for and went back to her family in Pennsylvania. I do not fault her for it, but the silence she left was significant." "I am sorry," Birdie said. "It was the right outcome," he said. "We were not suited. I understood that better in the aftermath than I had in the middle of it. But yes, I know that particular quiet you are describing." The road home was long, and the light was beautiful, and they talked, and were silent in turns with equal comfort. By the time the lights of Callow Creek appeared in the distance, the stars had come out above them, brilliant and numberless in the way that the open sky of West Texas allowed, unpolluted by anything but distance and dark. He drove her all the way to the Hart property rather than leaving her at the edge of town, which she had not asked for but which she found she was grateful for. Mrs. Creel came to the door with June when they heard the wagon, and June came down the porch steps in her nightgown at a speed that suggested she had not been actually sleeping, which Mrs. Creel confirmed with an amused look. Silas helped Birdie down from the wagon seat with a hand at her elbow, steady and brief and proper. He said good night and tipped his hat to Mrs. Creel, and told June to get to bed in the tone of a man who found this entire small domestic scene something he liked the look of, though he said nothing of the kind. He drove home under the stars thinking about her precision with cornbread and the sound of her real laugh and the way she had looked at the hills when she talked about silence, and he understood that he was in something of a situation from which he did not particularly want to be rescued. The weeks that followed were shaped by the rhythm of spring work on both their properties, and by the natural frequency of contact that the easement arrangement required. He came to the creek crossing twice in those weeks to work on establishing the water access point properly, digging a proper approach on his side, and reinforcing the crossing so his cattle would not churn the banks to mud. She was generally working somewhere on her land when he arrived, and they would stop and talk for a while in the way of neighbors, and then return to their separate work. These encounters had the comfortable quality of something that was becoming a habit, and habits have their own momentum. He started coming by the store on Saturdays, not to sell her things, though she always found something she needed, but to ask how the week had gone, how the 5 remaining cattle were doing, how June was settling into the warmer weather. He would ask after her kitchen garden, which she was putting in along the south side of the house, and she would tell him about what was coming up and what the deer had gotten into, and the conversations would stretch longer than they strictly needed to. June had formed an opinion about Silas Reed. She expressed this opinion with the completeness that 5-year-olds bring to all opinions, which is to say with absolute certainty and no ambiguity whatsoever. She told her mother one evening at supper that she thought Mr. Reed was nice, and that he smelled like coffee and wood, and that she thought it would be good if he came to supper sometime. Birdie looked at her daughter over the beans and biscuits and felt a complicated mixture of amusement and something more tender and unsettling. "He is a neighbor and a business associate," she told June carefully. "But he smiles at you different than he smiles at other people," June said, with the devastating perceptiveness of a small child. Birdie changed the subject. But she thought about it, sitting at the kitchen table later that night with the lamp burning low and the sound of the night country coming through the open window, the tree frogs and the far-off coyotes, and the vast settling quiet of the land. She was a practical woman, but she was not dead, and she was not so drowned in grief and survival that she could not feel the particular warmth that settled in her chest when she thought about Silas Reed, about his gray-green eyes and his careful honesty, and the way he had simply extended a hand across a counter when she had nothing to offer but terms. She was also afraid. That was the truth she sat with in the lamplight, the truth she gave herself permission to name. Not afraid of him, but afraid of what it would mean to want something like that again, to build a bridge to another person and know that bridges could fall. She had been sitting with that fear for about 2 weeks when he showed up at her door on a Thursday evening, which was not their usual meeting day or time, with his hat in his hands and a directness in his expression that told her this was not a casual visit. She opened the door and looked at him and waited. "I have been trying to figure out the right way to say something," he said, "and I have concluded that there may not be a right way, so I am just going to say it plainly and let you decide what to do with it." "All right," she said. "I would like to call on you," he said, "if you are willing, not as a business arrangement and not as a neighbor, as a man who has found that he thinks about you considerably more than his schedule strictly requires, and who would like to explore whether that thinking is mutual." She was quiet for a moment. June was inside at the table with her doll and could not hear them over the sound of her own humming. "You are asking to court me," she said. "I am," he said simply. She looked at him in the golden evening light, this careful, unhurried man who had met her in the worst morning of her recent life and offered a counter-offer instead of pity, who had read her terms without calculation, who had talked to her about silence as if he understood what it was made of. She thought about bridges and about fear, and about the fact that she had crossed harder things than this. "I am willing," she said. Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not in the showy way, but in the way of a person who has been holding a tension they were not quite aware of and who has now released it. "Thank you," he said, with a sincerity that she felt all the way down. "You should come to supper on Sunday," she said. "June has already extended the invitation on your behalf for what it is worth." He looked startled, and then he laughed, which was the first time she had heard him really laugh fully, and it was a good sound. "Did she?" "She has opinions," Birdie said. "I suggest you reconcile yourself to that early." "I find I am already reconciled to it," he said. Sunday supper was roast chicken that Birdie had been cooking all afternoon, with biscuits and green beans from the garden and dried apple pie that June had helped with more than was strictly useful, but in the way that made the pie better regardless. Silas brought a small jar of honey from the store as a contribution and a piece of red ribbon for June, which she accepted with a gravity that suggested she had been expecting something of this nature. They sat at the table, the three of them, and there was a moment partway through the meal when Birdie looked across the table at Silas and June was telling him, in great detail, about the frog she had found by the creek that afternoon and what she had decided to name it, and he was listening to her with the same genuine attention he gave to everything. And the evening light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a warm bar of gold, and Birdie felt something shift inside her chest, deep and certain. Like a compass needle finding north, she looked down at her plate and breathed through it. He stayed until the sun was well gone and June had been put to bed, and then they sat on the porch in the dark and talked in low voices about everything and nothing. About what she hoped to do with the property in the coming year, about his plans for his own land and the cattle, about books they had read, which they both had opinions about, and about music, which turned out to be a place where they disagreed pleasantly. He thought he would like to learn to play the fiddle someday, and she thought the violin was the more practical instrument, and they went back and forth about this with a playful energy that made her face hurt from smiling. When he finally left, stepping off the porch and into the dark to find his horse tied at the post, he paused and looked back at her where she stood in the lamp glow from the window. "Good night, Birdie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded like something deliberate and cared for in his mouth. "Good night, Silas," she said. She stood on the porch and listened to him ride away into the dark, and she was afraid, and she was full of something warm and expanding, and she decided, standing there in the cool spring night, that both things could be true at once, and that the warm thing was worth the fear. The weeks of courtship that followed were unhurried in the way that suited both of them, two people who had each been shaped by loss and loneliness, and the particular gravity of this country, who understood that rushing toward something good was no more sensible than running away from it. He came to supper on Sundays, and they began to take walks on Wednesday evenings along the creek edge when the light was long and lovely, sometimes with June and sometimes, when Mrs. Creel was available to sit with her, without. He brought her things from the store that were practical, a good pair of work gloves when hers wore through, a jar of the good quality coffee, once a small bottle of rose water which he placed on the counter without ceremony and called a remnant from a shipment, though she was fairly certain it had not been purchased by accident. She brought him things from her kitchen when she had them to spare, a crock of preserves she had put up, a loaf of bread, a piece of the dried apple pie that had become something of a tradition between them. She came into the store, sometimes simply to talk, and they would lean on either side of the counter and talk about the news from the surrounding county, about the water rights situation that was becoming increasingly contentious between some of the larger ranchers to the west, about the new schoolteacher who had arrived in Callow Creek to run the school and who seemed, by all accounts, highly competent and rather formidable. June started school in September when it resumed after the summer break, which gave Birdie more hours in the day and a new set of small observations to share. June had already determined that arithmetic was acceptable and that reading was the best, and that another girl named Clara was going to be her best friend. All of this reported at supper with the absolute certainty of someone who has done a thorough assessment. One afternoon in late August, Birdie rode into town not on planned business, but because she had seen, from the road outside the Hart property, a man she did not recognize riding a circuit around her fence line and stopping at various points to look at the property in a way that made her uneasy. She did not know if it meant anything, but she had learned to pay attention to things that felt wrong, and that had felt wrong. She went to Silas because he knew more people in the county than she did, and because he was the person she went to when she needed to think something through with someone she trusted. She told him about it in the store, and he listened with his usual careful attention. He did not dismiss it or reassure her with vague comfort. He said he would ask around town to see if anyone knew the man by her description, a thin man in a brown coat on a roan horse. He also said, carefully, that she should let Sheriff Danvers know, just as a precaution, so that there was an official record that the incident had been noticed. She went to see the sheriff, who was a capable man named Ed Danvers with the weather-beaten face of someone who had been doing outdoor work for 30 years, and he noted what she said with the same unhurried seriousness. He said he would keep an eye out. It turned out, through the machinery of small-town information that operated with remarkable efficiency when something was worth knowing, that the man in the brown coat had been a representative of a land speculation company out of Dallas, one of the many that were circling the smaller properties of West Texas like vultures in a thermal, buying up land at low prices from owners in distress and consolidating it into larger parcels for resale. They had apparently assessed the Hart property as a potential acquisition, not knowing or not caring that it was no longer in financial distress. The representative did not return after Sheriff Danvers paid a call on him at his hotel. Birdie heard all of this from Silas, who had pieced it together through the usual channels, and she sat with it for a moment and then felt the old familiar spark of anger that she recognized from the morning at Harlan Duff's desk. The specific anger of a woman who has been looked at as a problem to be solved by someone else's benefit. "They thought I was easy prey," she said. "They were mistaken," Silas said. "They were," she agreed, with a firmness that she saw pleased him. The summer gave way to fall, and the fall in the Texas Hill Country was a beautiful thing, the oaks going amber and gold, the air losing its brutal edge, the evenings coming early and cool. Birdie had gotten her cattle to 12 head by the fall, buying back 2 animals from a neighboring rancher, and managing a successful breeding season with the pair she had kept. The property was stabilizing. She had put up enough preserves to last the winter and harvested a reasonable kitchen garden, and replaced the fence along the west boundary that had been falling since Thomas's illness had taken his attention away from maintenance. She was not prosperous, but she was steady, and steady felt very good. She and Silas had fallen into a kind of rhythm with each other that felt, to Birdie, like something she had not had before. Not the comfortable familiarity of a long marriage, not yet, but something with its own distinct quality. The quality of 2 people who genuinely liked each other's minds and company, who chose each other's presence rather than simply being accustomed to it, who were discovering, with ongoing interest, the inexhaustible variety of what the other person was made of. She had seen him angry once. Not at her, but at the situation when his supply wagon arrived with a damaged shipment of goods, and the driver had handled the complaints of the damage with an indifference that escalated the conversation. Silas had been controlled but very firm, and the combination of those 2 things had a quality that she found she respected, the absence of explosion with the presence of unmistakable resolve. He had sorted the situation out and then had been somewhat quieter than usual for the remainder of the afternoon, and she had simply let him be quiet, which she could tell he appreciated. He had seen her cry once. It was a Sunday evening, and she had been talking about Thomas, telling some story about him that had come up naturally in the conversation, and the story had ended in a wave of grief that caught her by surprise, the way grief sometimes waits in ambush behind an ordinary memory. She had excused herself to the kitchen and he had given her the space, and when she came back she had been composed again, and he had simply continued the conversation at the point where they had left off, without ceremony or forced comfort, which was exactly the right thing to do, and she told him later that she had been grateful for it. "You do not need me to fix grief," he had said. "You just need someone to still be there on the other side of it." She had looked at him for a long moment. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "I did not learn it from anywhere," he said. "I just know it about you." There were a good many moments like that, where something he said landed so precisely that she had to catch her breath around it. It was on a Wednesday evening walk in the last warm days of October, the creek running low and quiet beside them and the live oaks casting long shadows in the late afternoon light, that he stopped walking and turned to her and said what he had been building toward for months. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that the asking is its own thing, separate from any answer you give, and that whatever you answer I am still the same man who will be at the Mercantile tomorrow morning and at your door on Sunday." She turned toward him. The creek murmured beside them, and a mockingbird said three things from somewhere in the oaks and then was quiet. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am," he said, "if you will have me." She looked at him, this man who had met her in the worst hour of her recent life with a counter-offer instead of condescension, who had earned his way into her trust one honest moment at a time, who understood what silence was made of, and who made her laugh with her whole face, and who had, somewhere in the quiet accumulation of these months, become the person she wanted to tell things to at the end of the day. She was afraid still. She had expected the fear to be gone by now, or at least to have subsided to something manageable, but it was still there, the knowledge of what it cost to love someone and lose them, the understanding of how thoroughly the absence of a person could hollow out the world. That fear was real, and she did not dismiss it. But she was also this, a woman standing by a creek in the golden October light with a man who had looked at her with clear eyes from the beginning, who had never tried to diminish her or manage her or treat her difficulty as someone else's inconvenience, who had shown her again and again the particular quality of his character in the small, unremarkable moments that were the truest measure of a person. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath that might have been there since last spring. Then he stepped forward and took her face in his hands, those capable marked hands, and kissed her for the first time, gently and with great care, like something he had been wanting to do for a long time and intended to do exactly right. She kissed him back with the full warmth of everything she had been holding, and the creek ran beside them, and the mockingbird said one more thing from the oaks, and the Texas afternoon lay wide and golden around them. They were married in December, on a Saturday morning when the air was cold and bright, and the small Callow Creek church smelled of cedar boughs and candle wax. Birdie wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had let out and altered for the occasion, with her dark hair pinned up under a small hat with a ribbon. June was her only attendant, serious and solemn in a new dress that Silas had quietly arranged through a woman in town who did sewing, which Birdie had discovered only the morning of the wedding, and which had made her eyes fill so quickly that she had to press her fingers briefly to her face. The minister, Reverend Pollock, was a broad-shouldered man with a direct manner who performed the ceremony simply and sincerely, without unnecessary elaboration. Cal, who had become a kind of permanent fixture in Silas's operation, and had taken to June with the earnest protectiveness of a much older brother, stood at the back of the church grinning in a freshly cleaned shirt. Mrs. Creel was there, and Birdie's few close acquaintances from town, and some of the ranching families from the surrounding area who had come to know them both over the months. When Reverend Pollock asked if Silas Reed took this woman, Silas said he did in the clear and certain voice of a man who has decided something completely. When Birdie Hart answered the same question, she said "I do" in a voice that was just as certain, just as clear, and that made June whisper from beside her to the woman next to her, "That is my mama," in a tone of vast proprietary pride. There was a small celebration afterward at the church hall, with food contributed by various members of the community, which was the custom, and there was fiddle music from two men who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but to great general satisfaction. Silas danced with Birdie and then with June, who was lifted up and swung in circles until she shrieked with joy. People shook Silas's hand and embraced Birdie and said the good warm things that people say at occasions like this, and it was all ordinary in the best possible way. They had discussed where to live. It was a practical question, and they had handled it practically. The Hart property had the creek access, which was valuable, and the house was livable though it would benefit from expansion. His land to the east had the dry ground that was better for the cattle operation he was building. Together the two properties were 80 acres, which was enough to be genuinely viable. They agreed to deed both parcels under their combined name and planned to build a proper house in the spring, larger and more permanent, positioned between the two original structures to maximize access to both the creek and the better grazing ground. In the meantime, they would live in the Hart house, which was comfortable enough for the three of them, and he would keep a man working at the Mercantile most days, while he split his time between the store and the land. The hired man at the store turned out to be Cal, who had more aptitude for the business side of things than he had initially let on, and who turned out to be genuinely good with customers in his quiet way, which freed Silas to spend more time on the cattle and the land without the store suffering for it. He and Birdie worked out a rhythm of the combined operation with the same practical directness that had characterized their first negotiation, deciding things with good sense and without unnecessary drama, and the rhythm held. Winter in the hill country was cold and clear and still, and the evenings were long. They sat together at the kitchen table after June was in bed, Silas working on his ledgers or reading one of the books he borrowed from the small lending library the new schoolteacher had organized, Birdie working on mending or writing letters to her family in Missouri. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were simply quiet together, the good kind of quiet, the kind she had been missing since Thomas died, the kind that only exists when you are comfortable enough with a person to not need words to fill the space. She was happy. She examined the feeling carefully, the way she examined most things, wanting to understand it accurately rather than just claim it, and she found that it was the real thing. Not perfect, not without its complications, but genuine and deep in hers. In late January she told him she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with the coffee between them and the winter light coming through the window white and cold. She watched his face as she said it, that careful, observant face, and saw what moved across it. He set down his cup. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was layered in a way she was still learning to read, and then he said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "And fine, mostly fine." She paused. "Happy," she added, which was the truest thing. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles. "We are going to need a larger house sooner than spring," he said. She laughed. "We are going to need a great many things," she agreed. "We will get them," he said. With the same certainty he had brought to everything from the beginning. He was right. They began the new house in March, Silas drawing up the plans himself on paper at the kitchen table over several evenings, consulting Birdie on every element with a thoroughness that she appreciated enormously. The design that emerged was generous and practical, a proper farmhouse with a broad front porch and a large kitchen, and a bedroom for June, and a room that could serve as a study or an extra bedroom depending on what was needed, and of course a main bedroom for the two of them. The building took most of the spring, with Cal's help and the occasional assistance of neighboring ranchers who came out in the frontier tradition of communal labor, which was one of the genuine and lasting virtues of this way of life. By the time the house was habitable, it was May and Birdie was visibly showing, and June had decorated her new bedroom with things she had arranged herself with great personal satisfaction. The house smelled of fresh-cut wood and possibility. Birdie's second year on the Hartreed property, as she thought of it, was the richest of her adult life in many of the ways that matter most. The cattle herd had grown to 19 head, healthy and well-managed, Silas having an instinct for animal husbandry that he had clearly inherited from somewhere. The kitchen garden was the best she had ever grown. The Mercantile continued to be the solid, reliable operation it had always been, and Cal had proven so capable at running the day-to-day that Silas was increasingly free to focus on the land, which suited him in a way that operating a store had never quite done. June turned 6 in the spring and 7 that following year, growing with the uncomplicated vigor of a child who was securely loved and interestingly occupied. She had decided she would be a teacher when she grew up, having formed this opinion after the 3rd week of school, and maintaining it with her characteristic total conviction. She had also decided, after some initial assessment, that she was glad they were all living together in the new house, because the new house had a porch big enough to sit on and watch the lightning storms, and she thought that was an important feature. She had taken to calling Silas by his name rather than Mr. Reed, which he had quietly suggested was fine when she had asked him about it one afternoon. She did not call him father, which was also fine, which was its own kind of acknowledgement that Thomas had existed and mattered and could not simply be replaced by a new man walking into the house. Silas had understood this without being told, which was one of the many things that made Birdie love him. She had stopped bracing herself against that word, love. She had used it with caution for a long time, as if it were a loan she might have to pay back at considerable interest. But she had come to understand that it was not a loan but a living thing that grew rather than diminished when properly cared for. She loved Silas Reed with the full-grown, honest love of a woman who knew what she was doing, who was choosing it with clear eyes and an open heart. She told him this on a July evening, sitting on the new porch in the cooling air after supper, with the lightning bugs starting up in the field beyond the house. She said it simply and directly, the way she said most things. "I love you," she said. "I wanted to say it plainly. I have been thinking it for some time, and I want you to have the whole thought rather than the half of it." He turned toward her on the porch, and in the summer dark his gray-green eyes were very still and very bright, and he said, "I have been in love with you since that first Saturday morning when you worked those cattle without being asked and never once suggested it was anything other than perfectly ordinary." She smiled. "The cattle. You moved among them like you owned the ground you stood on," he said. "Which you did, but it was more than that. It was the way you moved. Like everything was worth doing completely." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm come around her, warm and certain. The lightning bugs were doing their slow, bright work in the field, and the night was wide and kind. "Everything is worth doing completely," she said. The baby was born in September, when the heat was finally breaking, and the evenings were beginning to carry that first cool edge of the coming fall. It was a long labor, which Birdie managed with the grim determination she brought to difficult things, with the doctor from town and Mrs. Creel both present, and Silas in the front room of the house with June, telling her whatever stories came to him to keep her occupied and calm, while the longest hours passed. The baby was a boy. Silas sat at the edge of the bed and held his son in the particular careful way of a man who understands the fragility and the weight of new life, and he looked at Birdie, who was exhausted and bright-eyed and completely herself, and he said nothing for a long moment because there was too much to say, and none of it needed saying right then. June came to the door and looked at the baby with the assessment of someone taking a thorough inventory. "He is very red," she said. "You were also very red," Birdie told her. "I do not remember that," June said, which was such an exact June thing to say that both adults laughed, and the baby was undisturbed by any of it. They named him Thomas Silas Reed, Thomas for the man who had come before and built this ground, Silas for the man who had walked onto it and made it something new. It was a name that held all of it, the whole honest history. The years moved. They moved in the way that good years do, not quickly but fully, each season bringing its own particular texture and task and gift. Thomas grew from a red-faced squalling newborn into a round-faced cheerful infant, and then into a sturdy toddler who approached the world with an enthusiasm that was both endearing and relentless. He was interested in everything and fearless about nothing, following his father around the property from the moment he could walk with any reliability, inserting himself into whatever was being done with the confident assumption that his participation was welcome. It generally was. June, at 9 and then 10 and then 11, grew into a serious and intelligent girl who read every book she could obtain and who had opinions about all of them. She had maintained her friendship with Clara, which had deepened into the kind of close female friendship that sustains a person throughout their life, and she remained devoted to the idea of teaching, which Callow Creek's schoolteacher, Miss Alderman, quietly encouraged by lending her extra books and sometimes letting her assist with the younger students during the last hour of the school day. Birdie watched her daughter grow and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing someone become fully and clearly themselves, which was one of the great privileges of parenthood. The cattle operation reached 30 head in the third year of their marriage, which was when Silas hired a proper ranch hand, a man named Diego who had grown up working cattle in the southern part of the state and who knew the work with a thoroughness that made the whole operation more efficient. Diego was quiet and meticulous, and had a gift with horses that bordered on remarkable, and he became in his way an essential part of the small world they were building. The Mercantile continued to grow, slowly and steadily, as Callow Creek itself grew. The town was expanding along with the region, new families arriving, new businesses establishing, the railroad that had been spoken of for years inching closer to becoming a real thing that would change commerce and travel in ways that everyone was speculating about, and no one could fully predict. Silas expanded the store's inventory twice, adding a dedicated agricultural supply section that served the growing farming community around the town, and the Mercantile became known through the county as the place to go for both reliability of stock and fairness of dealing, which was the kind of reputation that built itself slowly and lasted. They had been married for 2 years when Birdie's mother came to visit from Missouri for the first time. Her mother, a sharp-eyed small woman named Mee Calloway, who had survived her own considerable share of frontier hardship and wore it the way some women wear jewelry, as an ornament of pride, arrived on the stage from the east with 2 bags and a forthright manner, and assessed the entire Hartreed operation in approximately the first 24 hours. Her assessment was delivered to Birdie in the kitchen on the second morning, which was that the land was good, the house was solid, the cattle looked healthy, and Silas Reed was apparently not a fool, which Mee delivered as the highest available compliment. "He listens when you talk," Mee said, drinking her coffee and watching through the kitchen window where Silas was in the yard with Thomas on his hip and a look of patient attention as the boy explained something. "A man who listens is worth 2 who talk." "He is a good man, Mama," Birdie said. "I can see that," Mee said. "You picked well, Birdie, both times." And she said it with a simplicity that honored all of it, Thomas and the grief and the new beginning, without sentimentality or avoidance, just the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a woman who knew how life actually went. Birdie took her mother's hand across the table and held it, and they sat there for a moment, the 2 of them, in the morning kitchen of the house that had been built from a counter-offer and a handshake, and the accumulating particular substance of 2 people who had decided each other was worth choosing. There were harder years and easier years, as there always are. There was a drought the summer Thomas was 3 that stressed the cattle and the garden, and required careful management and some belt-tightening. There was a winter when Birdie had a lung illness that laid her low for 3 weeks and frightened everyone considerably, and during which Silas managed the household and the property and the children without complaint, and without any of the martyred sighing that some men employed when they were required to do the work of 2, and which she recovered from fully, if not without effort. There was a business difficulty at the store when a dishonest supplier delivered inferior goods, and tried to argue about compensation, which Silas handled with the same controlled firmness she had seen in him before, resolving it with the supplier's full capitulation and thereafter finding a better source. Through all of it, the through line was constant. The particular quality of their partnership, which was built on the same foundation it had always had, honesty and respect and the genuine pleasure of each other's company, plus the dimension that had grown alongside it, the warmth and the depth and the chosen constancy of love. They got a second dog in the year Thomas was 4. The first dog, a border collie named Patch who had belonged to the property when Birdie first came to it, had died in his old age the previous winter, which had been a grief for the whole family. The new dog was a cattle dog pup that Diego brought back from a trip south, claiming it was a working dog and not a pet, a claim that did not survive the first week because Thomas had already named him General by the second day, and June had taught him to shake hands by the third. General was neither particularly general nor especially distinguished in any military sense, but he was a good dog, loyal and energetic and possessed of a tail that seemed to wag at twice the speed of ordinary dogs' tails, and he became as central to the household as anyone else in it. When June was 12, she asked Silas a question that Birdie overheard from the kitchen without meaning to, standing very still with a dish towel in her hands. June asked Silas if he had loved her mother when he offered to buy the cattle. There was a pause in which Birdie held her breath. "No," Silas said honestly, "not yet. I knew she was remarkable and I knew I wanted to help her and I knew that I wanted to know her better, but love takes longer than a morning." "How long did it take?" June asked. Another pause. "I am not sure I could name the exact day," he said. "It was more like a river than a moment. It moved and deepened. I think by the time we were walking along the creek that first summer, it was already most of the way there." "She loves you too," June said, with the authority of someone reporting a well-established fact. "I know," he said, and his voice had a quality in it that made Birdie press the dish towel briefly to her face and then compose herself and go back to washing up. Thomas Silas Reed was 5 years old when he announced with great solemnity that he intended to work with the cattle when he grew up, specifically that he wanted to be a proper cowboy, and that he needed a rope of his own so he could practice. Silas procured the rope. The next 6 months were an education for everyone in the household on the topic of what a determined 5-year-old with a length of rope will attempt to lasso if given any opportunity, which included in order of occurrence: General, a fence post, a hen who did not appreciate it, Cal's boot while it was on Cal's foot, and once memorably, Silas's coffee cup in a maneuver that resulted in coffee on the table, but also in a display of rope technique that was genuinely not bad for someone who was not yet in school. Cal, who had become over the years something like a permanent and beloved fixture in their world, took it upon himself to properly teach Thomas the rope work, which was both genuinely useful and also redirected the lassoing ambitions toward more appropriate targets. Cal was good with children, in the affectionate, slightly bewildered way of a young man who had not planned to be good with children but found himself surrounded by them and adapting accordingly. He had a room in the small bunkhouse on the property and ate Sunday supper with the family more often than not and was, by the time Thomas was 5 and June was 13, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of their daily life that the idea of the place without him had become simply not thinkable. The spring that Thomas turned 6 was the spring the railroad came through, stopping 20 miles to the north of Callow Creek, but close enough to change the character of commerce in the area significantly. The supply lines became faster and more reliable, the cost of certain goods came down, the range of what was available expanded. For Reed's Mercantile this was a genuine boon, and Silas expanded the store for the 3rd time that summer, adding a whole new section along the back wall and taking on a second full-time employee in addition to Cal. The cattle operation, now at 42 head, also benefited from better access to markets, and the spring cattle drive that Silas organized in partnership with two neighboring ranching families that year returned a profit that was by far the best they had seen. They celebrated quietly at home, with a good supper and the children fed, and the evening extended past the usual hour so that they could sit on the porch and feel the satisfaction of it. "You were right," Birdie said in the dark of the porch with Thomas asleep against Silas's side and June inside reading. "About what specifically?" he asked. "About all of it," she said. "The counter-offer, the partnership, the land and the water." She paused, the walking toward something instead of away from it. He looked at her in the way he always had, with the full weight of his attention. "You are the one who walked toward it," he said. "You could have taken the money and thanked me and kept everything strictly business." "I was tempted to," she admitted. "I know," he said. "I could see you thinking about it, weighing it, being very thorough and practical about it." The warmth in his voice was unmistakable. "I am a practical woman," she said. "You are," he agreed. "That is one of the very many things I love about you." They carried Thomas to bed between them, the way they had done dozens of times, the child as boneless and heavy as warm bread in sleep, and then they came back to the porch for a little while longer, side by side in the Texas night, the land spread around them dark and wide, and full of the sounds of things living and growing. She thought sometimes, in these moments, about the morning she had walked out of that bank with nothing, 60 days between her and disaster, every certainty she had built stripped away. About the way she had stood on the porch of the bank and told herself to breathe, just breathe. About crossing the street. About the bell above the door. About looking up and seeing a man she barely knew who had turned out to be exactly who he was from the very beginning, which was the rarest and most valuable thing. She had crossed that street and walked into a Mercantile and come out with something she had not known she was looking for, which was not just a counter-offer and not just a solution to a crisis, but the beginning of an entirely different life, larger and more full and more truly her own than any she had previously imagined for herself. She had worked for it. That was important, and she knew it. She had not been rescued. She had negotiated and built and chosen every step of the way. And she had done it alongside a man who had never once tried to make her smaller in the doing of it. That was love as she had come to understand it, not the swooning variety of the dime novels that came occasionally through the store. The real kind. The kind that looked at you clearly and helped you look at yourself clearly, and then got to work alongside you on whatever needed doing. Birdie Hart Reed, of the Hartreed property outside Callow Creek, Texas, sat on her porch in the summer of 1888 with her husband beside her, and the stars enormous overhead and General, the cattle dog, sleeping in a puddle of himself at the porch steps. And she was a woman who had everything she needed, and most of what she wanted, and enough understanding of how rare that was to never take it for granted. In the kitchen June was still reading, lamp burning late, which was a negotiated compromise. She could read past her usual bedtime if she kept her grades high, which she always did. She would be 14 in the fall and was already talking, with the earnest ambition of someone who had decided something irrevocable, about attending a proper school for teachers, the normal school up in the county capital, when she was of age. Silas had already begun putting money aside for it without making any announcement about having done so, which Birdie had discovered when she reviewed the household accounts and which she had brought up with him over supper in the simple and direct manner she had always used. He had looked at her across the table and said, "She has the ability. I see no reason she should not have the opportunity." Birdie had said, "She is my daughter." "She is," he had said. "She is also a young person who will be significant whatever she becomes, and it seems right to make sure she has the ground under her to become it fully." She had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I am going to love you for the rest of my life." "That is convenient," he had said, "because I plan on the same thing." Thomas stirred in his sleep in the bedroom and called out once, some fragment of a dream, and then settled. Silas tilted his head toward the sound, and then relaxed when silence resumed. The automatic parental monitoring that never quite turned off, the permanent low alertness of people responsible for small lives, which was exhausting and essential, and one of the quieter forms of love. "I think he is going to be fine," Birdie said. "I think so too," Silas agreed, "though I am withholding final judgment until the rope situation is fully resolved." She laughed quietly so as not to wake him. The summer deepened and peaked and began its slow decline toward fall. The cattle grew fat on the summer grass. The garden produced abundantly. The Mercantile was busy with the seasonal traffic of a growing region. June read everything she could find and helped with the younger children at school when Miss Alderman asked her to. Thomas graduated from rope practice to actual assistance with light cattle work, which Diego supervised with the patience of a man who had worked with many beginners and had made his peace with the learning curve. General, the cattle dog remained emphatically not a working dog but a beloved one. And on the Hartreed property in Callow Creek, Texas, in the October of 1888, Birdie told Silas over Sunday morning coffee that they were expecting another child. He looked at her with the same layered expression he had worn the first time, that careful face that showed everything and nothing all at once, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Tired, good." "The house has room," he said. "The house has room," she agreed. He squeezed her hand and held it. Outside the morning was clear and cool, and the cattle were moving in the far field, and Cal was coming across the yard, toward the barn, and June's voice could be heard from somewhere inside the house, telling Thomas something in the particular tone of a 13-year-old, informing a 6-year-old of a fact the 6-year-old did not want to accept. General barked once at something in the distance, and then apparently decided it was not worth pursuing. The ordinary, extraordinary morning of a life built from the ground up, from a counter-offer and a handshake, and the choice to cross the street and walk through the door, from the willingness of two people to look at each other with clear eyes, and decide that the other person was worth the work and the risk, and the whole long committed business of loving someone through whatever came. Birdie Hart Reed sat at her kitchen table in the October light and held her husband's hand and thought about the bank and the 60 days and the bell above the Mercantile door, about how close everything had come to going another way entirely, and she was grateful, the way you are only grateful for things that you understand you almost lost before you found them. She had walked out of the bank with nothing. She had walked into the Mercantile and found everything, not because it was handed to her, because she was the kind of woman who crossed streets when she needed to, who sat down at counters and stated her terms, who shook hands and meant it, who chose love with the same eyes-open practical courage she brought to everything else in her life. And because on that side of the counter, there had been a man who recognized a remarkable woman when she walked through his door and had the good sense to make her an offer worth accepting. The second baby was born in May, a boy again, round-faced and healthy and possessed of an excellent set of lungs, which he employed enthusiastically in announcing his arrival. Thomas inspected his new brother with the evaluating air of someone who had been briefed on the situation and was checking the actual results against the briefing. June held the baby with the careful competence of a young woman who had been paying close attention to how babies worked and had concluded she was ready to demonstrate this. General was excluded from the birth room but positioned himself outside the door and was the first animal to meet the newcomer when all was settled and the household restabilized, which he did with a thorough and respectful sniff. They named him James, which was Silas's father's name. James Reed, small and red and furious with the world, and then, over the following weeks, gradually reconciling himself to its existence with increasing equanimity. June was 17 when she left for the normal school, carrying a bag packed with characteristic efficiency, and a list of books she intended to find in the school's library, and a composure that broke briefly when she hugged Birdie on the platform where the stage coach was waiting. Birdie held her daughter and breathed her in and told her she was going to be extraordinary, which she believed completely, and June gathered herself and climbed onto the stage and turned to wave once from the window with a brightness in her expression that was equal parts excitement and love. Silas stood beside Birdie on the platform and put his hand at her back, steady and present. Thomas, now 11, was attempting not to look moved by his sister's departure and was not entirely succeeding. James, who was 5, was simply sad about it and said so without complication. "She will write," Silas said. "She will write constantly," Birdie agreed. "She will probably fill the postal service." She did write constantly, long detailed letters full of her observations about the school and her fellow students, and the books she was reading, and the teaching methods she was studying and the world as she was encountering it. Birdie read each letter twice, once fast and once slow, and kept them in a box on the shelf in the study. Thomas, as he moved through his early teens, became a genuine hand with the cattle, developing under Diego's tutelage and Silas's oversight into someone who understood the work at a level that went beyond labor into something more like art. He was easy with animals and had good judgment in the field and a patience that had come from somewhere in his character that was his entirely. He was also, it became clear around 14, going to be quite tall, a fact that seemed to please him moderately and the ceiling beams somewhat less. James was a sunnier version of Thomas, with his mother's dark eyes and Silas's tendency toward careful observation, which he applied primarily to animals and weather and the inner workings of machines. Any machine, anything with moving parts which he would disassemble with great care and then reassemble, usually correctly. He became the person who fixed things in the household, which was both useful and occasionally alarming when he was young enough that the fixing attempts were not yet fully calibrated. Silas turned 42 the year that James turned 7, and Thomas turned 13, and Birdie had her 39th birthday in the autumn. They had been married for 9 years. He had more silver in his dark hair now and lines at the corners of his eyes that came from working outdoors in all weathers and from a great deal of living. And he was, by Birdie's considered and partial assessment, more himself than ever, which was to say more precisely and exactly the man she had chosen, distilled by time into the finest version of what he had always been. She told him this on his birthday, which they marked quietly with a good supper, and the cake that Thomas had requested on Silas's behalf be chocolate, and that James had contributed to the making of in his fashion, which involved some structural ambitions that exceeded the actual structural properties of cake, but resulted in something edible and festive. He listened to what she said with that same quality of full attention he had always given her words, and when she was done he said, "You are better than I deserved." "You deserved exactly what you received," she told him, "and so did I. That is the point." He looked at her across the table, over the remains of the birthday supper, with the lamp burning between them and the boys in their beds, and the house settling around them in the autumn dark. 9 years of a life looked back at them through each other's eyes, 9 years of mornings and crises, and cattle and groceries and children and laughing and grieving and building and resting and choosing, always choosing each other. "I walked into my own store that morning," he said. "I had gotten in a shipment of coffee, and I was updating the ledger. And the bell above the door rang and you walked in and I could see it on you immediately, what the bank had done. Not the grief of it, though that was there too, but the particular way you held your chin up when you were not going to let something break you in public. And I thought that I had not seen that kind of determination in a long time, and I wanted to know what would become of it." "Now you know," she said. "Now I know," he agreed. "It became all of this, which is considerably more than I could have anticipated." She reached across the table and took his hand, those capable marked hands that she knew now the way she knew her own, every scar and callus, and the particular warmth of them. She held it and he held hers, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Texas night was clear and enormous, and the stars were the same stars that had been there when they drove back from Hargrove Falls that first time, countless and close. This was what she had walked toward when she crossed the street. This table, these hands, this house full of children and work, and the ordinary sacred substance of a shared life. She had walked in with her list of necessities, flour and salt and lamp oil and thread, and she had come out with this, with everything. She was a practical woman. She knew the value of a good counter offer. And she knew, sitting at her kitchen table in the autumn of 1891 in Callow Creek, Texas, with her husband's hand in hers and her children sleeping, and her whole hard-won, abundant life arranged around her like something built to last, that she had accepted the best one that had ever been put to her. The years rolled on in Callow Creek, golden and full, and stitched through with the particular texture of a life well lived. June came home from the normal school 2 years after she had left, and she took a position teaching at the very school she had attended as a child, now expanded to accommodate the growing town's children. She stood at the front of that classroom with the straightness of someone who had always known this was where she was meant to be, and she was magnificent at it. Miss Alderman, who had retired by then, attended the first day of June's teaching and sat in the back of the classroom with her hands folded in her lap and an expression of profound satisfaction. June was June in all the ways she had ever been, direct and certain and full of opinions, and she was loved by her students with the complex loyalty that children give to teachers who genuinely respect their intelligence. She moved into a small house of her own in town, which Birdie helped her set up with the practical efficiency that was their shared inheritance, and she lived there with her books and her considerable self and was, as far as anyone could tell, deeply happy. Thomas, at 16, made it clear that the cattle and the land were his intended life, which pleased Silas and felt right to everyone who had watched him grow into his work. He went out with Diego on his first real cattle drive at 17 and came back sun-dark and tired and quietly proud of himself. And Silas shook his hand on the porch when he returned with the same gravity he had used on that very first Saturday morning with the cattle pen, and Thomas stood straight under it. James, who fixed things and loved machines with a devotion that was slightly religious in its intensity, became increasingly fascinated by the machinery that was coming into the region with the industrial edge of the changing times, the new farm implements, the improved wagon mechanisms, the equipment that was changing how things were done on the land. Diego, who had a practical bent himself, encouraged this, and there was talk of James going north eventually to study engineering in some form, though that was still years away. And Reed's Mercantile continued to stand in Callow Creek on the main street across from the bank, its sign a little faded now, but freshly repainted every few years, its shelves stocked with the reliable abundance that Silas had built into it from the start. He was behind the counter most mornings still, though he trusted the operation largely to the 2 capable employees who knew the stock as well as he did by now. He was there not because the business required him, but because he liked it, liked the contact with people, liked knowing what was needed and having it. He was there on the morning, some 11 years after he had first seen her walk through the door, when Birdie came in to buy a spool of thread. Not dark blue this time, a rich red, for the quilt she was making for James's room. She came in and the bell chimed above the door and he looked up from the counter, as he always did. And she came to the counter in the particular way she walked, that straight-backed certain manner, and she looked at him across the counter the way she had that first morning, clear-eyed and direct. "I need a spool of red thread," she said, "and coffee if you have the good kind in." "I have the good kind in," he said. "It came on yesterday's supply wagon." She smiled at him, the real smile, the one that had come out that first day when he said something that was genuinely wry rather than politely cheerful, the one he had been producing in her for 11 years with varying degrees of intention. "That is good to hear," she said. He went and got her thread and weighed her coffee and set it all on the counter and totaled it in the ledger with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She paid and he wrapped the coffee carefully and she put it in her basket and stood for a moment longer at the counter, not because there was more business, but because this was also what they did, had always done, stood on either side of this counter and talked about the day and the week and what was needed and what was possible. "Come for supper Sunday," she said. "Thomas will be in from the Eastern Range. June said she would come if she has not got too much correcting to do. James wants to show you something he has been working on that involves a wheel and a gear, and I cannot entirely explain it." "I would not miss it," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up her basket. "Come home before dark if you can. There is going to be a good sunset." She said it the way you say things to someone who knows exactly what you mean by all of it. "Come home before dark. There is going to be a good sunset. Come home, come home." He watched her go out through the door, the bell chiming cheerfully behind her, and the door swung closed, and he stood behind the counter for a moment, in the cool, dim interior of the store that smelled of coffee and leather, and the familiar good smell of goods that were there to be needed. And he thought about a morning 11 years ago, when a woman had walked in with a list and a dignity that would not be breached, and he had set down his pen and given her his full attention. And he had never once had reason to regret a single moment of what had followed. He finished the morning's work and closed the ledger and told his employee he would be back in the afternoon, and he walked out through the same door Birdie had walked through, into the bright Texas noon, and he went home. The house was warm and full of the smell of something baking. James was in the yard with his wheel and his gear. General, now an old dog with a slower wag but the same devotion, was in his customary place on the porch steps. The cattle moved in the far field with the slow certainty of animals in good health on good ground. The creek murmured at the northern edge of the property as it had always done, as it would do long after all of them were gone, steady and cold and entirely indifferent to the human world it ran beside, except as a gift to those who knew how to make use of it. Birdie was in the kitchen. He could hear her moving around in there, the particular sound of her, which he would know in any room in any darkness. He came inside and hung his hat, and she looked up from the counter where she was working, and she gave him the look she always gave him when he came home in the middle of the day unexpectedly, which was partly quizzical and partly pleased, and partly the straightforward acknowledgment of a woman who was simply always glad when he came through the door. "You are early," she said. "There is going to be a good sunset," he said. She looked at him for a moment, this woman he had loved since before he had a word for it, this extraordinary practical fierce tender woman who had walked into his store with 60 days and a straight spine and a counter offer of her own that she had not known she was carrying yet, and she smiled at him with everything she had. "There is," she agreed. "Come and help me with this." He crossed the kitchen and came to stand beside her at the counter, and she handed him something to do, and they worked side by side in the warm afternoon light with the whole of their life arranged around them, solid and real and full, enclosed on all sides like a house with good walls and a fire in the hearth, and there was nowhere else in the world either of them would rather have been.